All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining on a Saturday morning. Um, I really appreciate it. Just a little short background on me that affects my approach to this and how much I appreciate all of you being here and how I'm going to try to serve all of your needs in some ways, and I am sure provide some things that are not useful to you, individual people at different times. Um, Both at Japan Society and in my teaching career, I have had the privilege of visiting literally hundreds of schools. I started teaching in a public school in a suburb of New York. I've now taught at two independent schools. I've taught in Japan, and my wife is a public school teacher at a high school in the Bronx. Um, and what I would say is, um, it's obvious that depending where you're teaching, who you're teaching, what you have the freedom to teach or not to teach, and who's in your classroom, and your background about Japan, what you need and what's helpful is going to vary from person to person. So I am going to try my best to provide something that is useful for all of you, to provide enough basic background so that all of this makes sense, even though I know many of you already know that. But to spend more time on some framing and thinking about some resources that you all can use in different ways in your classroom. Um, to start, I always like to teach by thinking of questions I want my students to answer. Um, and we're looking at two historic events that are groundbreaking, that raise questions that almost overwhelm the mind. Is to think, like, how can you get in a 4 or 5 year period, two nations where both the people and the nations have almost a vitriolic hate of one another to becoming some of the closest allies. To give you an idea of how vitriolic the hate of the United States was towards Japan towards the end of the war, there was actually a poll taken where a significant portion of the American population, when you were getting to 1944 and 1945, actually wanted to wipe out the entire Japanese population, not just win the war, not just knock out the soldiers, but attack the citizens. And the US war plan, late in the war, was actually to wear down Japan by just killing as many Japanese people as possible so that they would give in. There was also on the Japanese side, not just on the part of the government, but for a lot of reasons that if you were at the previous session, you probably heard about or many might know, there was a development of a hatred of the United States within Japan during the period leading up to the war. So you have this vitriolic hate, a brutal war on all sides that was experienced in very personal ways by almost all members of both populations, right? It's very different than if you think of US wars now, um, where in World War II, most Americans would have known someone who was killed or badly injured. Pretty much anybody living in Japan in 1945 would have had a relative or a close friend who was killed or injured um, in the war. The second huge question, that in some ways is a timeless question, is how can you turn a nation that is totally devastated in almost every way to go from that total devastation to recovery? And it actually wasn't that short a period of time. It did not happen fully during the occupation, but the roots of that are in the occupation. So to look at that. So that's one way to look at it. I am going to use some slides. So I will share those um, while I talk along. Hang on a minute. Okay, sorry, they have redone Zoom since I last did this. Um, Here we go. Okay, Yumi, whoops. Can I just get a thumbs up, Yumi, that you can actually see the slides?
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay. So to start with, one of the questions I think is really important whenever you teach about something like atomic bombings is to ask yourself, and all of you may have different answers, what is your teaching goal in studying the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I will throw out a few questions that I've considered that I've taught over the years. They may or may not be the questions that are useful for you. Um, I also will throw out some ideas that you want to think about. Before I get there, let me just give you a little bit of an overview so that you know sort of where we're going. In this overview, I am going, or in this lecture, I'm going to give you some basic overview of sort of the events and the narratives of the atomic bombings and the occupation. This is actually one area where, compared to when I started teaching many years ago, AI actually can be useful in getting like basic dates and things like that. So I'm not going to sit in this short period of time a lot on dates and timeline. I'm going to try to provide you framing and resources for first the atomic bomb and then the occupation. A second thing I want to say, and many of you who are experienced teachers know this, um, is something to think about when teaching about death and destruction, um, particularly devastating death like this. There's two things that I always preface it by with my students, because we're going to talk a lot about suffering. Um, the first is to acknowledge that for any individual, when someone they know dies, regardless of the cause, it could be a heart attack, it could be a shooting, it could be a regular death in war, for that individual and those people around them, that is a tragedy. That is a tragedy. Um, and the reason I've learned that over the years, and most of you experience this now, is many of us have students in our classroom who are experience war. You will always have people in your classroom who are experiencing early deaths around them, is that it sometimes can be felt when we talk about something like the atomic bombings that we are ignoring the horrible personal tragedy that occurs in deaths that are not newsworthy or are not the things that become part of teacher seminars on the 80th anniversary of the end of a war. The second thing I like to avoid, and not all agree on this, is I like to avoid discussions of comparative suffering. Did the Japanese people in the atomic bombing suffer more then? And then you can fill in the blank. Um, I don't find that to be a productive discussion. Even before we were in the current political sort of atmosphere we're in now, I think right now would be a particular difficult topic to go, but I have always prefaced it that way. Suffering is suffering, and we're trying to understand the context of what happened here. So you want to say, what is your teaching goal in studying the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Some questions I think are worth looking at. What actually happened? I'm not going to spend, I said, a lot of time on this, but I am a firm believer. All my students would always say this whenever I begin a unit. What do you need to know? Well, you need to know what actually happened. There can be disputes about narrative, but there are usually some basic facts that people all can agree on. Um, when did things happen? That type of stuff. You do need to know that, and your students need to know that. To what extent and in what ways were the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki unique events? This is a huge question that there will be different viewpoints on. What were the impacts of the atomic bombings on Japanese history, politics, culture, and or the arts? Um, this next question is actually a really useful one when you're thinking about where many of you are probably teaching, where you're not teaching a course about Japan, and you don't have the luxury to spend an extensive time talking only about Japan, period by period, and have, like you would in a college course, 3 or 4 sessions on the atomic bombings and the occupation, but it might be a very short period, and you have to figure out how it fits in your course. What were the political, cultural, and or artistic impacts of these events on world history? Because they definitely were there. And a final important question that I think is really worth thinking about, because there are both political and cultural implications to this. How were or are these events memorialized and remembered? And why are they remembered in these ways? One framing question I've sometimes used to start a class, and it would depend what you've taught before, whether or not this makes sense or when to ask it, is to ask this, and I think you all probably know this is a bit of a trick question. What two Japanese cities experienced the greatest casualties in one day or night of World War II? And as many of you probably know, the answer is Hiroshima and Tokyo. It is not Nagasaki. Um, far more people were actually killed in one day in the firebombing of Tokyo, in which case 90 to 100,000 people were killed in a day, than were killed in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. So, what is unique about these two events is not the number of deaths, and actually is not even the number of civilian deaths. I would argue there are things that are very unique about the atomic bombings, but it is not just about the numbers. just to get started, some basic data, and even teaching this data, depending on your teaching purposes, even presenting this data actually has, I wouldn't call it problems, but has complexities. The date can't be disputed, right? Hiroshima, if we're talking August 6th, 1945, approximate deaths, and we'll talk about this in a minute, by the end of 1945, about 140,000. You will see different figures, and we'll talk about why in a minute. Um, Something that is not unique to Hiroshima, but is true of both atomic bombings, including in the purpose of the atomic bombings. Most of those deaths were civilians. For Nagasaki, it's August 9th, 1945. By the end of 1945, there's approximately 50 to 70,000 deaths attributed to the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. As many of you know, there are also people who die after 1945 who you should attribute the cause of their death to the atomic bombings, because it's very clear, there's not really much disagreement, at least for a certain period of time, that they're due to the effects of radiation caused by the atomic bombings, even though those individuals did not die by the end of 1945. So the actual number of people killed by the atomic bombings would be larger. Um, Understanding casualty numbers is actually something really important, and it goes beyond discussions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This actually, I think, is very important to understand just to make sense of the world that students live in now and will live in the future. Because the way people talk about casualty numbers affects the way people understand events. It affects the way that they approach politics, policy. Um, it's often a very complex process. Understanding methodology is very, very important. So, for example, when you are going to talk about the number of people killed um, for the atomic bombings, one thing that's difficult is you would have to figure out exactly, they have approximations of the number of people who were in the cities at the time. You can figure out how many sort of weren't there afterwards. Um, there are some good records, some not great records, and then assessing which deaths, especially as you move further away from the actual dates of the bombing, were a result of the bombings and which were the results of cancers that may have been caused by other sources, becomes more complicated. I would suggest as a really excellent resource that is publicly available for free. There's an article by Alex Wellerstein called Counting the Dead at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was in the Bulletin of Concern Asian scholars. And it is, I would argue, I mean, there's nothing such as down the middle scholarship. Um, it is not vitriolic at all. It is a very approachable way where Professor Wellerstein looks at the methodologies in which you come to very different counts of the number of casualties in these two areas. And whether it's teaching Hiroshima and Nagasaki or teaching something else where these number of deaths become an important source of especially dispute, I think this is a great article to understand both specifically Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's also an excellent article to help understand arguments we may have about sort of what happened in other military contexts. I would say this article is appropriate for advanced high school students. It is a little bit challenging. It's an excellent resource for you to use as a teacher in preparing a lesson. There are also parts of the article where, although you may not assign the whole article, there may be excerpts you take out or references to primary sources that could be extraordinarily useful. All right, in teaching about it, how you introduce the bomb and how the bomb has been introduced over the years affects how students understand the atomic bomb. It also affects how it's been understood by populations historically. So, for example, this picture I'm showing you, I actually don't remember where I pulled it from. It's very, if you look at Japanese history textbooks that were assigned or approved to be used in Japanese classrooms after the war, there was a long period where the atomic bombs were not included in Japanese history textbooks. When you start to see when the atomic bomb is first introduced, it was pictures of this type that are included. This is also a picture that is commonly used in to present the bomb at the beginning. So one thing I use when I use visual learning, it's a way to look at a primary source. It's something I stole from the New York Times learning section, is when I first show students a picture, I say, what do you see? And actually describe what you see. And the reality is when you see the atomic bomb produced like this, if you don't understand what that cloud is coming from, and what is underneath that cloud and the incredible destruction that's going on underneath, it's actually beautiful. And that is one of the main, an important theme actually in including Japanese art about the atomic bomb is that contrast between the actual visual beauty of the mushroom cloud while understanding the extraordinary pain and destruction that that cloud caused. So to start with, what do you see is both an exercise in understanding of seeing whether students who might know what it means can really focus on what they see. But also to think about it this is I also like to sometimes ask the visualizers, what do you feel? And this is actually important. And it's important thinking also that this picture of the cloud was one of the primary ways for many people that the atomic bomb was introduced is it is a very different feeling if you're introduced into the bomb is this type of mushroom cloud. And we can also show how images without lying, without making anything up, can, I wouldn't say what you say, manipulate or affect the way people may view a particular thing. So for instance, if this is the primary way that the atomic bomb is presented, it's going to have one impact on what people think and feel, perhaps about the use of nuclear weapons or about the event itself. So that's one way. A second way would be to use a picture like this. Again, then what do you see? And again, students can here see, they can see the incredible destruction. It's physical destruction. It's at a distance. So there is a difference between that mushroom cloud and this picture. Um, most students, when I've used this, and I would say myself, even understanding what all this represents, it doesn't have a visceral impact the way that some other photos I can use, and I'm going to show you in a minute, would. And then again, the question, what do you feel? And while in the end, I think historians want to understand the rationality behind things and have an analytical explanation, when you're looking at resources, what people feel actually is important. Um, then you can use this resource, and this is a bit of a trick one, is if you start with what do you see, I think most people, if you went back and forth, you say, what do you see with this? And if you went, what do you feel with this? Compared to if you use this is the atomic bomb. Most people, when they see this, there is an emotional response to this picture, and that's appropriate. In fact, I think for many of you, particularly for teaching younger students, you might not even want to use a picture like this because for younger students, this would just be too disturbing. The reality is, if you lined up those two pictures I just showed you side by side, this one and the mushroom cloud, I think most people without context would say, this is horrible. Humans should never do this to someone else. And that's a sentiment that I think many of us could agree with. The fact is, this actually is not from the atomic bombings. This is a picture from the fire bombings of Tokyo. And you can see pictures in cities all over Japan, because as I think many of you know, the United States firebombed cities across the Japanese archipelago in the final year of the war. They killed tens of thousands of people in multiple cities in one night or day of bombing. It was usually night bombing in most of these cities, primarily civilians, and the charred remains in many of these cities were left over. And that's not atomic bombing. And this has a much more visceral reaction. Okay. You could also use this. And one thing I would caution is it's one of the things I really worry about in teaching about the atomic bombings is that you not be gratuitous, right? Obviously, the person, he was actually alive when this picture was taken. I believe he passed away shortly after. This is a person who experienced incredible suffering, and he's a person. Um, I don't have a problem using this in an educational talk because I think seeing this helps understand what the atomic bomb actually did and the specific effects. Um, but I think obviously, if you describe what you see here, and if a student describes what they feel when they see a picture like this, even though what you're seeing here is the death of one person, it is going to have a much larger impact, likely, than this, which is a picture where you could pretty much figure out a lot more than one person died in this kind of picture. And there was a lot destroyed, a total devastation of the city, and certainly has a much larger impact, probably on an emotional, visceral level. And that level is important than something like the mushroom crowd. And I show this both for thinking about teaching, but also thinking about the way people have understood the bomb is different images have been used at different times for different purposes on large population scales by governments, what appeared in textbooks that are approved by governments at different times. And while it is not a simple straight line from this is what was in textbooks or these were the images that were primarily used to how people felt about the bomb or how their policies were made, there is a definite impact. Another important part of the atomic bomb, and this I would argue is it's not 100% distinctive in the sense that there are other types of weapons that continue to have effects after wars are done, but that is specific to the bomb is the bombings, the atomic bomb, is the creation of both some discrimination of those who experienced it against those who experienced it, and illnesses and cancers, including deaths, that are caused by the bomb well after the bombs had been used and well after the war had ended. A specific area that both intersects the specific effects of atomic bombs and nuclear weapons, as well as is very important in thinking about Japanese culture, is the topic of hibakusha. Hibakusha are people who experience the bomb. They're survivors of the atomic bombing. Um, I think those stories and the stories of hibakusha can be used effectively in the classroom and are essential for understanding the atomic bombings on multiple levels. Um, in terms of thinking of the specific effects of the bomb, it's the obvious portion of people being affected by basically radiation poisoning and the cancers caused by radiation poisoning. A second is the way that Japan comes to understand themselves as the unique victims of the bomb. One thing to understand, and I'm not going to go into the details, I think there's actually another lecture on the Japan Society website you can use that explains it, is actually after the atomic bombs fell for about a 10-year period, it was until about 1954 to 55 period for various reasons, in Japan, the narrative that was presented and generally was understood by most Japanese people is there was a thought of the people of Hiroshima and the people of Nagasaki as the victims of the atomic bomb, not Japan as victims of the atomic bomb. That narrative changed in the mid 50s, and that's where you get more of the narrative that becomes very important in Japanese politics and culture of Japan being the victim of the atomic bombings and Japan being an extraordinarily strong anti nuclear state. Um, it also relates to there has been in post-war Japan discrimination against people who survived the atomic bombings, and also for people who survived the atomic bombings and actually witnessed what went on and saw not as visual images, but actually saw the incredible death and destruction, smelled what the city smelled like, because you could smell when they talk about it, you can smell the decomposing bodies, you can smell the burnt bodies. They saw the rivers filled with people dying. Some of them saw just things that are horrific. It lived with them. But there was also discrimination and concern that, for example, if you were hibakusha and you survived, that you may have had sort of genetic things happen to you so that if you tried to have children, your children would have um, inborn difficulties in the boarding, so it could be hard sometimes for hibakusha to find marriage partners or a feeling that there was something wrong with the hibakusha, as well as something you'll often hear, and this might not be specific to atomic bombs, or it isn't, is often when you hear stories, is stories of survivors' guilt. Not necessarily that they did something in that moment, although you would hear stories of people who had to make horrific choices in the moment so that they could survive. But even if they did not, kind of the idea, and you don't just hear it's about atomic bombing, of why did I survive and someone else died? Because most Hibakusha would have had certainly friends and often family members who passed away in the bombing. Um, these two pictures are two pictures that are actually people I got to know at Japan Society, and there's resources about them. The one I'm going to put my cursor over, I don't know if it appears left or right here, over here, is Mr. Sasaki. His sister was actually the person who died in the story many of you know of Sadako and the Thousand Cranes. And that story I'm going to tell you really briefly because this is part of the change for Japan viewing itself as the victim of atomic bombs as opposed to just Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Is his sister, when she was about 10 years after the war, she died of the effects of radiation poisoning. And as she was doing it, she started folding paper cranes with the idea that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you will have a wish come true. And obviously, she wished to survive. The story, from various ways, got picked up all over Japan, and there were huge peace rallies of children all over Japan to support Sadako and against the atomic bombings, concluding in a huge amount of people showing up on the anniversary of the bombing shortly after she died, and her picture appeared in newspapers all over the world, has been made famous in stories in the United States of Sadako and the Thousand Cranes. And that's her brother, who actually donated one of the last five cranes he still had to the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York City. So I believe you can actually still see it there. And he tells a powerful story of, even though he was very young at the time, so it's hard for him to actually remember the bombing itself. He remembers a little bit about it. It certainly affected his life later. The gentleman over here is Mr. Sugio Ito, and he actually has an extraordinary story that is very teachable for, I think, also people in the United States, and it humanizes it, of where he lost his brother about a month after the bombing due to the sickness caused by the radiation. He survived that. And then he lost his son in 9/11. And I am not sure if it's still online. There was a period where online he had his oral history told. It was incredibly moving, in which he tells the story of both losing his brother and losing his son. It very much humanizes it, but it also he talks about in his case, and it's not a story of victimhood, but he talks about the manner in which being a survivor of the atomic bomb has this particular effect on him. Finally, with the Hibakusha, where it's important is if you look at some of the groups that have even won Nobel Prizes in recent years in the anti-nuclear movement, often Hibakusha are at the center of those movements. So they are worth looking at. In terms of thinking about how to teach the bomb, just a few resources you can use that are useful depending who you're teaching. One way is to use a film documentary memoir to teach. A classic one, I wouldn't suggest showing this entire documentary to students. It can be a little bit dry over the long term, is Fog of War by Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara, as many of you know, he was Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, but before that, what you might not know, he was a very senior official in the US military at the end of World War II. And he was in the room when decisions were made about the fire bombings of Japan and ultimately, to a degree, the atomic bombing, although more the fire bombings. And what I would suggest is if you show the two chapters about the ending of the war in Japan, it's very useful in the following ways. Number one, McNamara, who is feeling a lot of guilt at this towards the end of his life, introduces an idea that is worth talking about, is the idea of what he calls proportionality, in thinking about whether something was a war crime or not, or should be done or shouldn't be done in the context of war. And what essentially proportionality is the idea of, is whatever you are going to do and the pain you're going to cause, is it in proportion to both what you're trying to accomplish? His answer was, even though he participated in the firebombing, was that no, the firebombing was not, and in his mind, the atomic bombing was not. And in his mind, and it's interesting because he was the one, and he said this, and so did the person in charge. He said that if they lost the war, he would have been considered a war criminal, was his perspective. And there's a really, really good scene in there that if you only have like a minute to use a documentary in class, is great for kind of for American students, giving context to both the firebombing and the atomic bombing, where they go through and they show the picture. They show a brief picture of different cities in Japan that were firebombed and the number of people who were killed. And then he flips it. These are cities that were just pretty much very much destroyed. And he'll put in the name of an American city that had a similar population in 1945, so that when they hear about a city that many American students or non-Japanese students would have never heard of, they might understand that that city is the same size as Detroit or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., um, or even New York City or Los Angeles. It very much humanizes it. So that's a very useful teaching tool. Something else you can use is just in terms of the way things look, and I'm going to just show it to you briefly. There's no sound actually in the footage. Is to see what this actually looked like on the film being taken when the Enola Gay, which is the plane that dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, dropped it. The United States knew this was sort of special. It's the first time this war technology had been used, so they made sure it was filmed. They had another plane flying along to film it. So I'm just going to show that to you. It takes a little over a minute. And again, if you think about what do you see, what do you feel when you see this without understanding the destruction? And it's interesting because there's sort of a little bit of a different perspective at the beginning versus the end. So I'll just show you all of it because I do think it's useful. So there, if it's hard to see on your screen, that's the actual mushroom cloud being filmed at the time that it was happening. Okay, now this is spliced in a little later. I'm not sure actually exactly how much time had elapsed from the actual bombing till this was taken. So I always find that to be sort of useful footage depending on what you're trying to teach, but it can be used, I think, in multiple different types of courses. Um, you can also use, I don't have the video here, but a documentary memoir to teach. You wouldn't want to use the whole thing, but there's a famous, although it's animated, it's called Barefoot Gen, which is the actual story told. It's semi-autobiographical of a person who lived in Hiroshima at the time of the bombing, and it goes through his personal experiences told through. It was originally a manga, which is like a comic book, and then was made into an anime. I will warn you if you want to use those classes to be sure not to make the classic mistake of showing something without fully previewing it. It is, even though it is a anime or a comic, it's incredibly graphic. It also incredibly humanizes it. And one of the people who was killed in this memoir is actually a Korean who was there against their will living in Hiroshima, which raises other issues about the war because actually there were a lot of Koreans who were also killed by the atomic bombing because many of them had been forced to relocate to Hiroshima to work in the war factories. Another resources that's excellent is it's called in English The Flash Over Hiroshima or Hiroshima no Pika. It is a picture book. It is in theory a children's book. I probably wouldn't show this to a small child because it's actually quite graphic. Um, but it is a way both through art to get at more the emotional side of the story. It's told through the viewpoint of somebody who's drawing pictures of their memories of what it actually looked like after the flash, well, before and then after the flash went off. So it's an excellent resource that can be used in a relatively short amount of time. Um, some additional resources you can use, and if you just type these into Google, you'll find them. There is a group called Hibakusha Stories, and any source you use, you want to know kind of what the bias is or what their purpose is. Hibakusha Stories, where it's really, I mean, it's useful for many things. It does have short oral histories told by many of the Hibakusha or survivors that are translated into English, or some of them actually wrote them in English. There are a few Hibakusha who speak English. It's useful that way. Just to be aware, it is a group that was founded, and the stories are being told who are very strongly anti-nuclear weapons. I'm not taking a particular political point here. So it is important to understand that these are being presented in the interest of a position of trying to remove nuclear weapons to remove nuclear weapons. But that doesn't make the stories inherently political in and of themselves. They're very useful, even if you want to stay away from the politics. Also, you wouldn't think of this necessarily, but the 9/11 Tribute Museum does have the biography of Sugio Ito and Masahiro Sasaki, a short interview from them up on their site in their teaching resources. They don't right now have, there used to be a video interview that is no longer up there, but maybe you can find somewhere in case you want to sort of put a little color into the story. All right. The war ends shortly after the atomic bombs fall. Um, there are some questions, a lot of questions around the end of the war and questions around how we tell the story of the end of the war. A few I sometimes like to use is why do we remember the bombs and forget the fire bombs? In some ways, that's a political story. In some ways, it's about the differences between atomic bombing and conventional bombing. But that is a really tough and important question. why was the bomb dropped when it was? One thing I would caution with this is I would say this is more a story in many ways of American history than Japanese history. Because something that was once said to me by somebody who was from Hiroshima and was there when the bomb was dropped, and I totally agree with. He says, you know what? There's a big difference in a story being told by those who dropped the bomb versus those whom it was dropped upon. And part of the difference is the people who had the bomb dropped on them had no choice about it being dropped. That's an American decision. Um, but in answering this question, and it is often the reason that Japan is included in courses on world history, you're going to see conflicting narratives. You're going to see multiple causes as to why it was dropped. And it is also in the context of both World War II, and as many of you know, there is a theory that at least partially, if not fully, the atomic bombs were directed as much at the Soviet Union, especially the second one, as they were ending the war quickly. There's disagreement over that particular argument. The argument there being, though, that the United States knew that they were about to enter into a conflict with the Soviet Union. One of the big advantages the United States was going to have was that they had an atomic bomb, or we had an atomic bomb. The Soviet Union did not, and therefore that would affect the way that negotiations happen. Number two, by the time you're getting to the end of the war, there was a race to see who was controlling which territory that Japan had occupied over on the Asian mainland, especially in northern China. Um, at that point, the Soviet Union was rapidly moving into areas of northern China that Japan had occupied. And the faster the war ended, the less territory that would be controlled by the Soviet Union at the end of the war. So there's an argument made that one reason to drop the bomb, especially the second one, is it would end the war more quickly. And for political purposes in the post-war, that will put the United States at an advantage. Other questions? How big was the wartime to post-war transition? Right? That's both about economics, it's about culture. There's often been a narrative told, like Japan, there's this sudden end in the split. There's Japan before World War II and Japan after World War II, and these are two totally different nations. And then, and this is now 30, 40 years ago now, that historians in both the United States and Japan started to change the way the narrative was told, was to say, well, it's a really interesting question to ask what changed when the war ended. But it's also actually a really interesting and important question to ask what stayed the same? It's not like everything ends and changes on either August 15th, 1945, which is when the hostilities end, or September 2nd, 1945, when the final treaty is signed. And also, there's a question you could ask if you're interested in politics: is why didn't Japan surrender earlier? Because it is quite clear if you look at it, and I think many of you studied this in the previous session if you were there, that by the time you're getting into 1945, if you can see the documentation that was available to senior Japanese leaders, that Japan was not going to win the war, right? It was just a question of how it was going to end. All right. The surrender itself, and this again is a good visual resource to use, it happens on the USS Missouri, which you can still visit if you go to Hawaii, on September 2nd, 1945. This picture is a classic picture used when, at least when I used to teach classes on Japanese history, is the visuals quite telling. And there's a good way to do visual resources. You have a lot of Americans dressed in, I wouldn't say casual fatigues, but they're in kind of casual stances. They are not standing at attention. These are two of the most senior officials in Japan at the time, dressed in full suits. And this picture, which was widely published, although he's not bowing down to the soldier, he's bent over so he can sign the treaty. But there is this clear picture, and of you can look at the lines here. Even it's almost a perfect angle of a U.S. is a senior military official. He's actually a general, standing. I wouldn't say at ease, but he is not standing at attention, kind of staring down at the Japanese official. Um, there's a pure picture of hierarchy that is depicted here. This was sent broadly in both the United States, and importantly, this was purposely widely publicized in Japan when the occupation began, because the occupation begins the same day. Um, the surrender document itself, I'm not going to go into it. It is an important document to look at. It was an unconditional surrender. You can find the full surrender document. It's a scan of the actual document, which is actually a fun thing sometimes to use with students. It might be hard to read for lower level students. I think many high school students could actually read it themselves. It's available at the U.S. National Archives website and other places as well, but there's a link to it. part two here, the occupation, which I'm going to go through relatively quickly. Um, we're going to start with this, with the visual image. Most American students, and even maybe current Japanese students in Japan, if you ask them to draw a picture of Japan, it is not this. But the reality is, this isn't a holistic depiction of Japan on September 2nd, 1945. But this is an actual picture of Japan in September 1945. And as you can see here, it is a visceral image. And the reason I show it is there was a lot of personal suffering going on in Japan at the end of the war. You can extrapolate from this image, and I will tell you, it would be accurate. Um, there was a huge difficulty in terms of food availability, shelter, um, just in terms of basic welfare and safety of people living in Japan. And so one of the big questions that the occupation had to have, and the Japanese people had to have, and the Japanese government had to have, is when you have so many people who don't have the resources to survive and thrive, what do you do? Um, and what happened is really, it's a fascinating story that talks about social welfare, it talks about politics, it talks about international relations, it talks about a global context. Um, I'm not going to go through a blow by blow of the occupation. You can actually, Japan Society has a very quick overview that's available. It's quite useful. It's called The Allied Occupation of Japan. Um, you can find it quite easily on the Japan Society website. It is at a level that I think most high school students, maybe some higher level middle school students, could actually read on their own. It's not that long to read. And certainly if you're teaching and you have questions like what happened when and just some basics, it's a very useful resource. If you have to teach and you need something you need to read in, say, 10 minutes to get the quick picture, I think it's quite useful. Um, again, the idea of teaching through questions. These are not the only questions to ask, but these are some questions I've used over the years with high school students in different contexts and found students have found quite engaging, right? How does a nation and how do individuals recover from utter devastation? And one thing I would forefront is, and this is a problem sometimes in the way the occupation has been taught in the United States, is to remember the role, and I would argue a somewhat central role, of Japanese people in recovery. Once you get to the occupation, it's not just that the Allied occupation did things to and for Japan. Japanese people did things and organized things for themselves, and that actually plays a really important role in the recovery and the way it worked. I think it also plays a really important role in understanding why some things we can learn about the occupation may be relevant for things that happen in other parts of the world and other times, and some things actually may not. How does a nation and individuals that have acted well outside the bounds of international law and widely accepted moral standards reconcile and recover? How does a nation move forward from an imperialistic past? And again, these are complex questions. Not all historians agree on the answer. How does a nation awash in fear, division, and loss reunite? Um, at the end of the war, talking about internal in Japan, but also talking about what was going to go on. A lot of Japanese people were actually terrified of what was going to happen when the US soldiers entered, not just US or other allied soldiers entered to occupy Japan. They were very fearful of retribution. They were very fearful of the occupying forces behaving extraordinarily poorly and being very hurtful to Japan. It's complex what actually happened on the whole. It was a those horrible things on the whole did not happen. There are incidents that certainly did. There were also some divisions within Japan, and certainly afterward, there was a lot of suffering, and there was even some, it wasn't huge, there was less than, well, you would maybe some people would expect more, but there was obviously some discrimination as to how Japan got itself in the state it was. And also, how can your students examine these questions or other questions about Japan on both a macro level, sort of that big picture, global history, and micro level, which is often more engaging, in a manner in which they will be inherently interested, like what I call the lunchroom test. If you're teaching the class right before the kids go to lunch, right, the ideal is they walk out and they're still talking about it when they arrive at the lunchroom. And there are things about both the atomic bombings and the occupation, I think that would are doable. Um, quick overview, not to spend much time on it. Key events around the occupation and post-war policy in and around Japan, because they are going to be important the way the occupation plays out. The Cold War begins and the Iron Curtain comes down sort of in Eastern Europe, including the phrase of the Iron Curtain. There is decolonization going on throughout Asia and Africa, which is going to affect the way the occupation is approached. There's the formation of the United Nations and other international organizations, which is going to have a profound effect both on the occupation and Japan itself. The Japanese Constitution itself, we're going to talk a little bit more detail about that, is released in 1947, mostly written in 46. Midway through, there's going to be something we'll talk about briefly called the reverse course, where what we're going to see is in the first, I'd say about year and a half to 2 years of the occupation, about 2 years, the people in power who are doing the occupation are approaching with one purpose. There's some events, including the one you see below, the Chinese Civil War, and some other things going on around the Cold War, and concerns about the survival of Japan itself and the Japanese people, where there is a change in some basic approaches to the occupation that occur. There's a civil war in China, ultimately resulting in, we see number 8 there, the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in October 49, which has also a tremendous effect on the occupation in Japan. The Soviet detonation of the atomic bomb in August 49, right? So you can see 49 is also a huge year in the way that the United States and other allied powers are going to be thinking about what role do they want Japan to be playing in this post-war world. The Korean War, 1950 to 53, both in terms of politics and also the economy of Japan, for a lot of reasons I'm not going to get into a lot today. There's actually another lecture, I think, that is up on the Japan Society website that explains this. It results in a huge infusion of cash into Japan between 1950 and 53. And finally, we're going to go talk about the ending of the occupation, right? The San Francisco Peace Treaty, which is signed September 51, goes into effect April 52. And then a few hours after that treaty was signed, the US-Japan Security Treaty was signed on the same day and goes into effect the day the occupation ends. Also with the occupation, there's sort of an alphabet soup. I'm going to mention 2 things you're going to hear a lot about. One is SCAP. It's called the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. It is the official group that is running the occupation. It is not officially a U.S. occupation. It includes members from multiple nations. That is actually important to remember. But the United States is by far the preeminent power within the Allied powers and will make most of the major decisions. It's a little bit more nuanced than what I just said. Um, and something called General Headquarters, or GHQ, which is the leadership of the occupied powers, focused out of Tokyo. And again, that group, which is led for most of the time by General MacArthur, will make many of the decisions about occupation policy from an Allied perspective. In terms of dates, it actually officially begins September 2nd, 1945. So there's a few weeks before the occupying powers enter Japan, and it ends officially April 28th, 1952. Some key questions about that SCAP had to answer, and also some Japanese people had to answer, right? One is, this was first a few our Japanese questions, or sorry, SCAP questions. What do they do with the war criminals? All right. What do they do with the emperor? What do they do with the politicians? What do they do with the military? What do they do with the bureaucracy? How do they make the country function? And that last question is important also for thinking of some of the above questions, because as you saw, it was going to be complicated to make Japan work again. It was not realistic for a bunch of outsiders, many of whom did not speak Japanese or know all that much about Japanese culture or Japanese infrastructure, to come in all by themselves and just make everybody able to eat, make Japan recover. That wasn't realistic. There were many people alive in Japan who knew how to run a modern economy, who knew how to run modern industry as you would define it in 1945, who knew how to make a government function in terms of there's many important day-to-day functionings of the government that aren't political. Just think about little things like picking up the garbage, things like that. But many of those people also were people who had been empowered during World War II. And so to decide who within Japan, who were in positions in the government, in industry, who knew how to make things function, um, but maybe had a little bit more responsibility for what had happened. That's a difficult question to answer. What are you going to do with all of them? And there were different answers over time. One of the biggest questions was going to happen to Emperor Hirohito. There was a narrative in the United States that all people in Japan sort of worship the emperor. The reality was much, much more complicated than that, but that's narrative. Um, there was a thought, and this was the ultimate decision, is that the United States could use the emperor if they kept him in power as a way to make policies work. Because if the emperor stayed in power, the thought, it wasn't totally accurate, was that Japanese people revered the emperor. And so, therefore, if the emperor, number one, seemed to be in favor of these policies and would help create them, if the emperor would advocate for peace and demilitarize Japan, if the emperor would advocate for people listening to the occupation, because the occupation itself was also concerned about people sort of not revolting, but pushing back, which did not happen. Um, he could be useful, and they also thought he could be useful symbolically. So I'm going to show you one of the most famous pictures. This is a picture taken during one of the first meeting between MacArthur and Hirohito. Um, and MacArthur actually was very interested in the emperor, and he liked, not to say he liked the imperial system, but he was actually excited kind of to meet the emperor. Um, when the emperor went into this meeting, he actually didn't know the outcome. He wasn't sure whether they were going to call for his execution, whether they were going to call for him to lose his titles, or what was going to happen. And MacArthur told him a little before this picture was taken that he actually was going to remain the emperor. Um, but again, this is a picture that is classically used in many university classes when we do introductions to Japanese history. There's the visual here that you can use with kids of, again, you see MacArthur towering over the emperor in kind of an informal pose, and the emperor dressed in a full, very formal suit, looking very much smaller. And that was done very purposefully to say the emperor is sort of inferior to the American military, but the American military is kind of supporting him in his continuation. Um, War crimes, again, this is going to be a big thing in both Japan and how Japan relates with the rest of the world. There is like what happens to those who violated the rules. There were Tokyo war crimes trials for the senior members. There were war crimes trials held actually throughout locations in Asia for other more junior members of the Japanese military who were accused of committing things that violated um, standards of war and how they should be carried out. I won't talk extensively about it. I think many of you probably know both in terms of Japan and Europe. As a legal document or as a legal procedure, war crimes and war crimes trials actually are very, very complicated. And there's been a lot of arguments about jurisprudence that actually a lot of ways that jurisprudence should be carried out actually were not followed, complicated by the fact that especially in the Tokyo War Crimes trial, the people who were put on trial, there really was not much doubt that they had responsibility in some way for horrible things having happened. Um, the senior members who were put on trial in Tokyo were found guilty and executed. There was one judge, though, and you see his picture here. He was an Indian judge who he very much thought Japan had done horrible things. He thought the people who were on trial actually had done horrible things, but he felt that jurisprudence was not carried out properly. Again, if you're looking at that topic of war crimes trials, responsibility, the Tokyo war crimes trials, there's a tremendous amount of information about it are worth looking into if that fits in your teaching goals. Education is a big area. It comes from the idea that Americans and some Japanese very much held, not all, that one of the reasons that Japan had behaved the way it had, and so many people had followed along with what the Japanese leaders wanted, was because of their education and almost an inculcation of, they think, of emperor worship and nationalism. So, right after the war, there was also an understanding that the Japanese education level was actually pretty high. So they did not want to get rid of, both on the Japan side and the occupation side, they didn't want to get rid of a relatively high education level in terms of the technical and reading skills that were needed, but they did want to get rid of the ideology. So immediately after they couldn't produce a whole bunch of new textbooks, they just crossed out all kinds of things that basically the occupation didn't approve of. And then they created a centralized system. It's this irony of they wanted more localized government, so the Japanese national government would become weaker, but they also wanted control of the textbooks and create a system later that's become very controversial, where there's a fair amount of central control of Japanese textbooks, um, where they produce new textbooks and they, a little oversimplification, but prescribed what would be in the Japanese curriculum in a way that would be considered denationalized and would downplay the role of the emperor and the imperial family, which meant that the textbooks being produced would have a lot of central control. They did try to get the schools up and running as quickly as possible. They made education through middle school mandatory, um, and they decided that that would have to be funded. That's something that continued to exist after the occupation ended. Poverty in Japanese society, again, you see the incredible poverty there. Not to go through it all, but there
Excuse
was,
me. I'm sorry, Dr.
yes.
Fish. I just
Hmm.
missed something when you were talking about education.
Hmm.
Who was it who prescribed the new Japanese education?
That was the SCAP, Supreme Command of the Allied Powers. What happened in a lot of it is this is actually a really good question of who prescribed what. Is there was a Japanese government in place and there was SCAP, and they talked to each other. The Japanese government was not a fully free Japanese government. So what would happen is the official policies were usually put out by the Japanese government, but they had to be at the very least approved by SCAP, and in many cases were written, or at least first drafts were written, and there might have been a few revisions by the Japanese government. And in this case, this is why I said there's a little nuance. The policies themselves were mostly written, I believe, by, it's been a while since I looked at the documents, were mostly written by SCAP. There were some modifications by the Japanese government, but in the end, SCAP has to approve everything. So exact authorship can be a little bit murky, but SCAP plays a huge role. There are some Japanese hands, and certainly in the actual implementation, what was Japanese people actually writing the textbooks, and actually figuring out how to get things distributed and figuring out like teaching systems and things like that. So it's cooperative with SCAP having a lot of control. Yeah, I hope that helps. Um,
Yes, thank you.
with, you're welcome. With poverty, again, this is one of the complicated things is you have this incredibly complex problem of how do you like recreate systems so that people can eat, food can be distributed. Um, and you go through sort of two parts here. What this is people who are looking to move around and sometimes get access to food. Um, Again, some of those details are in the article. There's a lot out there. It's very complicated. There was a tremendous amount of food insecurity in Japan for the first few years. Um, the simple version of what happens is when the occupation first begins, um, the occupying powers purge many members of the bureaucracy. They say they were complicit in what Japan did in the war. They are worried that they are essentially going to be enemies of the occupation and they deserve to be punished in power. So they purge many of the bureaucrats. They want to start to break down many of the Japanese corporate entities, thinking that they were large supporters of the war. And they do break up a number of what they call the zaibatsu, which are the huge corporations. Um, Pretty quickly, however, um, they find out that, or they decide, along with some people in Japan, that they want Japan, and this has to do with also the politics of being worried about like China civil war, eventually China, the communists winning there, the Soviet Union. So they want Japan to recover and be strong. That it was not possible to help Japan recover if all of the people who've been purged remain purged. And if all of the people they wanted to remove from sort of corporate Japan and the entities they wanted to break up ended up really getting broken up, they thought it'd be very hard to recover. So in the end, what happens is many of the bureaucrats who are purged, who are the people who do know things like how to make sure that the streets get cleaned, or if they need to be reconstructed, can be reconstructed, that the garbage gets picked up. When they are going to put it, they did put in a new food redistribution system. They needed people to administer it. And what they found is there were a lot of bureaucrats that existed. Many of them have been purged, actually had the expertise, both local knowledge and more technical expertise, to actually make these things happen. So around 47 and later, many of the ones who have been purged are sort of returned to their positions to put, both sometimes to create and put policies in place, um, to make them happen. To give you, if you want to do statistically, like how serious it was, in 1946, in an urban center in Japan, the average household spent 68% of their income on food. In comparison, if you went into about 10 years ago in the United States, I'm not sure exactly what this moment it is, the average American household, which would include households in the US on poverty, spent about 10% of their income on food, right? Um, and here again, you could see with the occupation on the social side, there is the relation between the US and Japan. There was a part of the occupation that was incredibly respectful. and wanted to be incredibly helpful. There was also, you can see it here, these are cartoons. There was also a way that was fairly widespread. There was a racial hierarchy that was widespread within the United States and the other countries that occupied that did come over to Japan, not necessarily in a hateful way, but also sort of looking down on Japan. So that became very complicated, right? Government in the Constitution. There was a decision to try to democratize Japan. Japan actually did have democracy, and had a tradition of democracy. It didn't look exactly like American. Sometimes it looked a little bit like European democracy. It worked or didn't work in different ways at different times. But it's not that democracy was a totally foreign concept to Japan or Japanese government. Um, there was a constitution. The US basically wrote the constitution. It was translated into Japanese, and Japan really didn't have much choice but to accept it. You can find an English version of the constitution. You can find it in many places. I put a link in here. I'm going to highlight 3 articles. We're not going to read them all, and these are very good. What to use with your class. One is Article 9, and this was the idea that Japan would become a peaceful nation. And Article 9 basically said that they couldn't have a military. What's interesting is this is put in place in 47. Around 47, shortly after this is released, the Allied powers, especially the United States, decided actually might be useful if Japan had a military, but they just released this part of the Constitution. So what happens is they create a nationalized police, which later will become known as the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. Article 9 is still in place, which limits the way that Japan can use what they call the self-defense forces. But in fact, Japan will end up to this day, actually has one of the larger militaries in the world. There's just a lot of limitations on how they can use it. Article 14, there was supposed to be an emphasis on equality. So they actually created an article in there that does not exist in the US Constitution that says all the people are equal under the law and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. Again, there's fascinating studies of Japanese culture and politics that go on of how does this actually play out in the real world in Japan, but that is in there. And then finally in there, I won't read the whole thing, but there is a sexual equality clause. Now we'd say gender equality, but this was 1946 to 47. It's written, right, with regard to choice of spouse, property rights, inheritance, choice of domicile, divorce, and other matters pertaining to marriage and the family, laws shall be enacted from the standpoint of individual dignity and the essential equality of the sexes. Again, it's fascinating to see the reality versus what is written in the Constitution, including in policy toward things that are sort of listed out in Article 24, but that is written in there. They also create the actual structures of the Japanese government, where it's created as a parliamentary democracy. The emperor exists, but is supposed to be a non-political figure. Is created through the Constitution, which still exists right now. When the occupation ends, it's in the middle of the Cold War. This is actually the signing of the treaty that ends. The person, you don't see him there, but the person who comes out in power at top is Yoshida Shigeru, who is an important leader. He's a fairly conservative leader. And what he decides, he calls GHQ, go home quickly. What he makes a decision, he says, basically, Japan should give in on many, many things, even if it's not ideal, so that the occupation will end. And then it's more a story of the post-war, post-occupation. Although Japan is in a very weakened state, it's very much a strategy of seeing how, even though Japan's in a weakened state, they can have at least a somewhat advantageous, or at least a good relationship with the United States in the way that will help Japan, including help Japan economically, sometimes giving in on things around security in the military. And so we'll end with this picture of Yoshida Shigeru, with not going into the details, but it's an important theme, is as the occupation ends, there are end parts of the occupation where you see people within Japan taking increasing power within Japan and ending it in a way that, from both an American and a Japanese point of view at the time, will have people in power in Japan who both sides will feel are reliable, will create reliable allies for the United States, with a goal of creating Japan as a stable ally of the United States, without, there was sort of an opposite purge. They tried to purge out the communists, the socialists, especially the communists, out of power, that would not end up and having sort of a radicalized or communist leaning way, that would be more conservative and a starch, sort of democratic and capitalist industrial society.